Hey everybody, like all of you, I decided to get to do this sermon from the comfort of my own home, my study here, so hopefully that's not too distracting for you from the usual settings you're used to saying these things. And because, of course, I'm on Zoom, all of you get to spend this time worrying and wondering, do I in fact have pants on? Just to relieve your worry, I do, in fact, have pants on, so you can no longer be distracted by that question that is always in the back of my mind, at least when I see someone talking or teaching on Zoom. So this week, in a little more serious note, we get to look at the story of Esther. Esther itself is such a tight, big, complete composition. It's a good story. It's hard to kind of lift a few verses out and really get the sense of the whole thing. I'll attempt to do that because I don't obviously have time to tell the whole thing, but hopefully you've gotten a chance to look at this story, and if you haven't, I would really recommend it. It's a great yarn. It's told very well, and I think you'll be very entertained by it. But the kind of quick and dirty plot of this story is we are a long way from home religiously. It's about people who have lost their home. They are migrants, more or less. They've been stolen from home. We've got Esther and her uncle or cousin Mordecai. We're not, depends on the translation. But it all starts as kind of royal intrigue. We've got the king of the empire, and he has a run in with his queen, and so he has to find a new queen. And one of the big themes we start seeing really early on is this king is a bit of a buffoon. He's getting manipulated by everyone around him. Everyone around him is kind of over dramatic, and that will be played kind of both ways in the story. But he gets a new queen, and this ends up being Esther. Esther is Jewish. Esther is someone who no one really expected to be queen of this big important empire. Her uncle or cousin Mordecai, because he wants to make sure she's okay when she's in the palace and he's not allowed to be there, starts hanging around the palace. And this has two important things for the story. One, he overhears some people that work at the palace are going to kill the king. They're going to overthrow this king. And so he warns Esther. She warns the king. He saves his life, and things gonna go back to business as usual. He never gets a reward. No one really acknowledges this, which comes back later in the story. The other problem is there is this puffed up kind of vizier strutting around named Haman. He's the bad guy in the story. He gets to curl his mustache almost every time he shows up. And Mordecai sees him and he won't bow to him. He will not honor him the way that he feels like he's deserved. Again, the story's not super clear as to why. But this guy Haman says, look, he can't stand it. And so this guy, Mordecai, who won't bow down, he's Jewish. Fine. We're going to kill them all. We are going to wipe out every Jew in the world. And he goes to the king. The king, again, being a bit of a buffoon, says, hey, I'll give you a bunch of money if you let me kill a whole bunch of people. And the king goes, okay, as long as you're willing to give enough money, right? This, of course, is going to kill God's people. And so Mordecai recognizes an opportunity to save everyone's life, and he says, Esther, you've got to use your influence. You've got to be brave, even though you're not allowed to go talk to the king without permission. You gotta be brave, and you need to change this plan. You need to rescue us. And so she does. She sets in motion a plan to kind of turn the tide. She starts having these dinners for the king. The king comes and he's excited. He says, okay, look, you obviously want something. What is it that you want? And so right before the second of these dinners, she's building up to the big moment when she says what's actually on her in her heart, that it's discovered that Mordecai had saved the king's life and they never did anything for him. And so Haman gets stuck with the job of taking his enemy out in the streets and proclaiming that the king is pleased with this guy who saved his life. And there's a series of very quick changes and turns that happen in this story. So I'm going to read just a little quick section out of this story, and this section is the moment when Esther actually reveals what it is she wants and needs. Haman is present, the king is present, no one else, but this is something that in her wisdom she's been building up for a little while. So I'm starting in Esther chapter 7. I'm reading from starting at verse 1. When the king and Haman came in for the banquet with Queen Esther, the king said to her, "This is the second day we've met for wine. What is your wish, Queen Esther? I'll give it to you. What do you want? I'll do anything, even give you half the kingdom." Queen Esther answered, "If it please the king, and if the king wishes, give me my life. That's my wish, and the lives of my people too. That is my desire. We've been sold, I and my people, to be wiped out, killed, and destroyed. If we simply had been made sold as male and female slaves, I would have said nothing. But no enemy can compensate the king for this kind of damage." King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther, "Who is this person? Where is he? Who would dare to do such a thing?" And Esther replied, "A man who hates an enemy, this wicked Haman." Haman was overcome with terror in the presence of the king and the queen. And this begins kind of the great reversals of this story. So pretty quickly, the king recognizes what he has allowed to happen, although the queen kind of lets him off the hook by blaming it all on Haman. And then the king loses his temper with Haman and says, "Fine, this guy wants to kill you and everyone else. Let's kill him instead." So he goes and gets killed. Mordecai gets his old job. And then Esther and Mordecai are able to send out letters. So because this law has gone out and says everyone gets to attack them on this certain day, and they simply write a letter that says, well, now they're allowed to defend themselves, and it's this big day of violence, and it's this big day of celebration. So wild story, very well written, very well put together. And as I was doing my homework for this talk this week, I discovered it's also a very divisive story. Some people just love this story. They think it is super obvious the ways God is working in it. And some people just hate this story. They hate that it's very ambiguous because you'll notice as I was retelling it, and you'll notice if you read it, an odd quirk of the story of Esther, especially for being in the Bible, is that God's name is never mentioned. As far as we can tell, no one does any praying. As far as we can tell, no one is doing any good religious, moral stuff in it. And people have been baffled by this for a long time. I think that this story is an interesting one because, like a lot of Jesus' parables, when we are not given the answer, we're kind of forced to stumble into it and figure out what our own answers are. And I think you can kind of see in a lot of the commentaries and other stuff that I read this week, you can kind of see people's biases coming out in a story like this. If your basic assumption is that this is just a well-put folk tale and that none of it's really true, that came out very quickly in the books I was reading. I think if your basic assumption is, yeah, obviously it's in the Bible, therefore God must be behind all these things, you're willing to look over some of the ambiguity. You're willing to look past some of the morally questionable behavior by almost every character in this story. You're also willing to look and see that the coincidences that are left and right in the story, in fact, show that God is present, whether it's big and obvious or not. But what I think is one of the important things about this story is it doesn't really follow the formula. Not only is God not present, not only are they not praying enough and being religious enough, I think lurking in a lot of our interpretation of the Bible is this kind of idea of like, this is what a good religious story looks like. You know, there's a good person, and then, something goes wrong, but they're a good religious person, so of course they pray or they trust God and do the right thing, and then God makes it all work out in the end, right? If you actually read the Bible, that story doesn't show up very often in it, but I still think that's kind of our assumption of life. That's our assumption of the way things are supposed to work in the religious world, right? If we're good religious people, God is being forced to take care of us. And I think the story of Esther is great because it makes us wrestle with maybe that assumption of the way things are supposed to be. I think it's great because it looks a lot more like real life than that story I just told. I don't think that's the way God is expecting us to be and expecting us to do things. I don't think that God has a formula. God is really willing to work with people as they are. Yeah, maybe Mordecai and Esther are not as good and religious as it. Maybe there's a little more culture getting it under their skin than they meant, or what we would prefer. as religious church people, right? But God seems to be willing in this story, because I obviously do think God is involved in it, even if he's very quiet and subtle. God is willing to work with actual human beings in actual historical situations that are just really messy. There's a lot of mixed motives on why people are doing things. There's a lot of, like I said, the king's kind of a buffoon. The bad guy is just pointlessly brutal and vicious. And yet the heroes are able to use shrewdness and wisdom to overcome. And I think it works because God is present. God is working with an actual normal historical situation. He's working with real human beings with both their flaws and their strengths. These are smart people. These are wise people who are using the cards they've been dealt in life, just like I think we have many people around us that are doing. We're doing the best we can with the situations we've been handled, and so I think people at times can think that religious people and that God or Jesus are just kind of naive. Like, yeah, the stuff they say, the way they think things through sounds really good, but this is real life. And I think the book of Esther is really good for us to point out, yeah, that's what God works in. He works with flawed human beings. He works in incredibly flawed situations, and hopefully, as tough as things are for many of us right now, I don't think we're in as nasty of a situation as Esther and Mordecai and their people were at that time. And yet, even in that horrible historical situation, working with people who were very much people and deeply flawed, God is able to work. God is able to work salvation. God is able to work a miracle and to show his salvation. He can bring good out of any situation. And so I just think that this story is really encouraging to me personally, just being reminded that at times when we are frustrated, when there are times when we think things cannot possibly work out again, as I bet Esther and Mordecai felt, and yet bang, bang, bang in this story, one thing gets overcome. All of a sudden, the bad guy is embarrassed publicly and recognizes something is wrong. Then, this tight planning that Esther has been attempting to do, it suddenly works out and everything's going to be okay. The people are allowed to defend themselves. The threat and the enemies are gone. And it's like waking up one day and all of a sudden everything's better. Everything fits. It's not that God required them to, pray super hard first. It's not that God needed to teach a lesson or tell them what they're supposed to. God's joy and desire in this, I think, is to save. God's joy and desire is to take care of things, even in a ambiguous, sticky situation we see in this. So yeah, this week it was kind of a roller coaster for me when I first read through all the hate around this story and how people just say, ugh, these people don't behave the way they should. This book isn't the way it should be. But at the end of it, I'm like, yeah, that's what life is. None of us are what we should be. None of us are behaving in ways that probably doesn't make God kind of go, oh, at times. And he's not sitting around waiting for us to meet some kind of ideal, religious or otherwise. He loves us as flawed human beings doing the best we can. He's willing to work with us as flawed human beings doing the best we can. So maybe we can give Esther and Mordecai a little bit of a break because God worked through them. Maybe we can give one another a little bit of a break because God can work through situations and people like this. Maybe we can give ourselves a little bit of a break, saying, you know what? God can still use me. God can still work with me if we're willing to trust, if we're willing to do the best we can with what we've been given. God is not intimidated by real life. God is working in the midst of real life, even situations like those that we find ourselves in. So those are the kinds of things I just felt very encouraged by in this story. And I hope it was encouraging to you as well. If you haven't had a chance to look at it, again, read it. It's a great story. And I think you'll be encouraged by who God is working with and to find God haunting this story, even though he's not as obvious as in other biblical stories.